Over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Leanne. Thanks for that terrific introduction. It's going to take me a little while to just get used to the microphone because I'm not used to talking with microphones or even rolling around the floor here with a microphone strapped to my head. So please bear with me. The first thing I want to say, yes, we will be doing a demonstration of Neurobyte and how you might use it to find evidence-based treatments. But before we get into it, it'd be really helpful for me to know in the audience here, there's some wonderful familiar faces, but could we have just a show of hands, who here is primarily a clinician? Okay, and who is primarily a person with lived experience of brain injury? Very good. And a researcher, and a student, and someone who's looking for the lecture on the accounting 101? No one? Okay, good. Excellent. All right. Well, it's a bit of a tough ask to follow Charlie Teo, who's a very charismatic speaker, but luckily what we're talking today isn't brain surgery, so I think we'll be okay. That's how that works. Okay, so firstly, we just want to acknowledge the traditional custodianship and law of the country in which the University of Sydney campuses stand. We pay our respects to those who have cared and continue to care for country. All right, so firstly I wanted to introduce Team Neurobyte. So you can see me up over on the left-hand side. So I'm a relatively new member of the team. I took over as director in 2020. And over on the top right-hand side, we have Robin Tate, who was one of the founders of Neurobyte. Neurobyte was put together by a wonderful big collaboration of researchers, of whom Leanne was one of them, Skye McDonald, Michael Purtices. So what we're seeing today really is the culmination of a lot of work done by them and others over the last 20 years or so. We also have a wonderful project manager, Janet Doubleday, and we have our two research assistants, Karishma Menon and Michaela Filipchova, who's also doing a PhD with Skye McDonald at UNSW. And also we have Graham Simpson, who's our lead of brain injury research at John Walsh Centre for Rehabilitation Research. And that's Graham spinning around. So, what we're going to cover today is just a short history of Neurobyte and how we might use Neurobyte to identify best practice. So that involves operating the Neurobyte website, search function, and what the results produce. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of our extra features, which include the online rater training and our rehabilitation summaries. One thing I have done is I've done a little bit of a case study as to how we might use Neurobyte for a clinical case. While we're going along, you might have a think about cases that you have and clinical problems that they have, where you might be searching for a style of intervention, or you might be looking for some evidence to back up what it is that you're doing. So we were established as PsychByte in 2004, effectively what happened was that it was identified that there was really a gap in terms of there was a growing literature in brain injury rehabilitation and in neurorehabilitation generally. But what was found was that in clinical practice, there was very little uptake of research findings. So this was kind of at the, I guess, the starting phase of what we might call knowledge translation now. So for a lot of researchers, what researchers would love to know is whether their research is actually being used to inform practice. And of course, being a clinician is very busy. You might go and do your graduate training or your undergraduate training at a particular institution at a particular time. That's when you pick up the bulk of what it is that you know about your trade. And it's difficult to keep up to date. It's difficult to see what's coming through. And specifically, you might find that you're in practice doing something you weren't necessarily trained for. So as for myself, I was trained as a clinical psychologist. We did do some training in neuropsychology, but not a lot. And certainly at the time that I did my training, there wasn't really anything like what we have now in terms of the research to say what you might do with somebody who has brain impairment. So there was a very identified gap. And so this group of researchers, you can see some familiar names in the papers listed here, embarked on this project to establish this database. And in doing so, one of the things that they did was they looked around at whether there were existing, oh, that button doesn't work, whether there was anything like it. And in fact, there was a similar database that had been established in physiotherapy, the Pedro database. From the Pedro database, there was derived a lot of the methodology that went into PsychBite, which then became NeuroBite. And also, at around the same time, we had SpeechBite, which I guess it was a project that developed, we would say, in parallel, very much, and there was a great amount of knowledge sharing between, and there has been a lot of collaboration between SpeechBite and NeuroBite over the years. So if we look back at 2004, what did the internet look like in 2004? So it's quite interesting. I remember first using the internet in the mid-1990s, and back then I think there were literally 200 web pages in the world. And I did a course on HTML language, and it was beautifully simple, but very limited in what it could do. Fast forward 10 years to that time when PsychBite was first set up, and the internet that we see today is completely different and transformed from back then. And it's difficult, I think, to really get your head around how far things have come, but also the fact that things like Facebook and Google were sort of starting out back then. So the seeds of what we have and we know and we use today was very much starting out then. There's a graph of search engines that we had, and effectively, NeuroBite is a search. It's a search machine or a search engine of sorts. And so at the time, you can see that the dominant, there were all sorts of different search engines we were using, and then Google's sort of just taken it over. There's certainly no asking Jeeves these days. So then I'll just fast forward now to NeuroBite, and this is the landing page for NeuroBite. So this is our main home page. So if you have your devices with you now, you can go to this web page. I actually, unfortunately, didn't put the web address on that slide, which would have been helpful, but if I go back to the previous one, you should be able to see neurobite.com, which is neuro with a dash, bite.com. You go to that web address, it should pull up that. If it doesn't, then please let me know. We've got a technical issue. So this is our main landing page. And on this, you can see a little bit of a description about what we actually are. So NeuroBite, previously PsychBite, is predominantly a database that catalogues studies of cognitive behavioural and other treatments for psychological impacts of brain impairment. As you can see, on this database, we catalogue a range of different publications. So We've got synthesized studies, so that would include practice guidelines, systematic reviews. We've got group studies, RCTs, non-RCTs. We've got case series. We do have a very big kind of component of single case experimental research. And you'll also see other features along the side, like our Twitter feed. If you're on Twitter, you can follow us at Neurobyte. Okay, now this is when we get into our search function. So what we can do is we can search on a variety of different fields. So we've got keyword search, author search, search for a particular journal. If you're used to searching databases, you'll see this is similar to what you might see on a PubMed search or a PsycInfo. So in our case here, we're going to select the target area of memory. We've got memory as one of the you can actually choose like quite specific things within memory as well. For this search, I've done a fairly general search on memory. And then we can look at neurological groups. So in this case, I've chosen traumatic brain injury, but we've got quite a broad range of neurocognitive impairments. So pretty much everything that fits into the current DSM-5 category for neurocognitive disorders, you'll find within these different clinical groups, neurological groups. Okay, so do a target memory. And then what we get is so just with this search, we've got 404 records, and these are all papers which in which there's an index record to do with traumatic brain injury or head injury and memory impairment, treating memory impairment. So it's quite a lot of results. Has anyone plugged in their own parameters into that search and come up with something? Yep. Okay, we might come back to you later on and see what your results are. Okay, so it's quite simple. Now, by comparison, if we go to Google and we plug in interventions for memory traumatic brain injury, we do get a result in half a second, but we get 11,600,000 results. It's not very helpful. But that's just general Google. So if we go to Google Scholar, which is a bit more, much more appropriate for what we're doing, we're still going to get 329,000 records. Now, critically, out of that 329,000 records, firstly, that's an overwhelming number compared to 404, but it's completely unfiltered. And if we go, this is a comparison with PsycInfo. This is a basic PsycInfo search. What we've got here from this search is that if we look at an intervention study for memory for traumatic brain injury or head injury, we actually get a much smaller number. We only get 29 studies. And so that's because the way that the terms have been indexed, our automatic, by plugging these into PsycInfo and just doing an automatic kind of withdrawal from that database, we're actually missing out on a lot of very relevant information. Now, if I go back to the team of people that you saw at the beginning, the reason why we have that team of people there is because they're going through thousands of studies every month and pulling out everything that could be related to treating memory impairments for people with traumatic brain injury. And so we can get much better, much more information, and we're not overwhelmed by information, and we don't have a paucity of information like we do here. Are there any librarians in the room, I should ask? So you probably look at my search strategy and go, what is he doing? Okay. Any questions so far? No? Okay, all right, so we only get 29. So I've mentioned all the things you'll find in Neurobyte. What we've got, so we started out, the team started out as predominantly TBI researchers, but coincidentally we've got more papers to do with stroke and dementia than TBI, and you can see we cover quite a lot of other neurological groups, so MS is quite a big one too. I thought that was quite interesting because we've always been very much predominantly focused on TBI and interested in that, but clearly, in terms of the volume of papers that are coming through and the relevance of papers that are coming through, research that's being done in stroke and dementia seems to be quite prolific. And I'd love to know why it is that that's the case, because I guess I live in a little bit of a TBI bubble. All right, in terms of target areas, Neurobyte gives you, out of a whole sample of about 7,000 papers, so we've got 7,000 catalogue studies. Out of those 7,000, most of those are in the in intervention targets to do with cognition or mental state. The next biggest category is behaviour and emotion, and then activity participation. Now obviously lots of studies have more than one target area, which is why if you add those numbers up you get a lot more than 7,000. In terms of the interventions, so we classified interventions in terms of cognitive interventions, psychological, functional, physical, assistive devices, multidisciplinary and holistic, carer-focused interventions or other interventions. We have even though we have a holistic category, I would say we also have a very holistic other category of interventions. We've got studies that catalogue things like art interventions or dance interventions. We do not exclude alternative therapies. We don't specifically exclude studies that include medication, although we are we're predominantly interested in non-pharmacological interventions. Up to the formatting, okay. All right, and as I mentioned, we've got over 7,000 studies. Now if you go onto our page, you'll see that there's around 7,300 studies. And this is the culmination of a big increase in our database holdings over the last 3 years. So over the last 3 years, we've been funded by iCare to do to really boost up the numbers of database holdings, and we went from 6,000 3 years ago up to over 7,300 now. So before I go on, I should definitely acknowledge the support of iCare in this project. In terms of what we're currently holding, we've got a comparison between 2004 and 2022. As you can see, there's a huge increase in the amount of literature. So the 2004 bars represent what had been done in published literature up until that point. So you can see in the last 18 years that much more has occurred than what existed in the whole of scientific history prior to that. We have our largest category is randomised controlled trials, and then you'll see we have this very much growing number of single case studies. What we also have is we have quite a lot of systematic reviews, and certainly over the course of the pandemic, we're seeing a lot of people doing systematic reviews when they couldn't access participants. So they sort of pivoted to doing systematic reviews. Okay. So I want to talk now a little bit about single case design stuff, and also what you'll see here, one of the features that we have is our, you might notice out of those studies that I've listed, there's ones that have that sort of light violet colour. So these ones are ones where we've done rehabilitation summaries, and that's another project I'll talk about in a minute. What you will notice here, just down the right-hand side, and I think this is a key feature of Neurobite and Pedro and SpeechBite as well, is that what we've got down the right-hand side is we've got these numbers, 19 out of 30, 14 out of 30. What these are our quality ratings. So one thing that you will find when you go through Neurobite is that we've got method quality rating scales we've applied to these different studies. So if we go right back to the beginning, and I'll show you the Google Scholar search on that that I did, and we got like 300,000 studies. What we get is we're not only getting an overwhelming amount of information, but we have no idea about the quality of the research that we're actually looking at. And so what we've tried to do with Neurobite is we've tried to identify from the studies that we have what are the studies that are worth your time looking at as clinicians. So I'll talk a little bit now about how we do that. Okay. So I'll just skip ahead a little bit. I'll go back. Okay. So what we've got, I've just pulled up a single case study that we've got here. So I guess one of the things about single case studies as opposed to group studies is that there's a lot of resistance from I guess researchers and clinicians that aren't familiar with single case designs at trusting the results from single case studies. And so a big part of our job is in educating clinicians and researchers that a properly conducted single case trial can actually have very reliable findings and very useful findings that are clinically applicable. And so what we've got here is we've got this rating scale, which is called the Robint, which I'll talk to you a bit more about in the next few slides. But what we've got is we've got some ratings here that are done by our team, which show you, firstly, is this single case study done with a design with a control? So that means, was there typically a baseline period, and then treatment was introduced, and then we saw the effect of the treatment. We have some other measures of internal validity, I should say, like, did we have assessment that was done by blind raters? These aren't raters that have problems seeing, these are raters that don't know whether the person's been receiving a particular treatment. Because otherwise, if it's being assessed by the clinician delivering the treatment, then there's a good chance it could be biased. So when you're thinking about, can I trust the results of a study, you could go through the paper and you could look at this for yourself. But if you're a busy clinician or researcher, you probably don't have time. And if you can see this, then you go, right, well, that's just, I know that I can trust this more because it's been properly conducted. It isn't just Paul had a clinical case, Paul thought a treatment was a good idea, Paul started doing the treatment and he rated the success of the treatment himself, and at the end of it he said, oh, that was a great treatment and haven't done a great job, and here's the article that I published out of it. Paul's gone, well, I'm going to see, firstly, Kate's an expert in what it is that I do, so maybe I'll get her to review what I've done, check to make sure that I've stuck with the treatment as it was written, made sure that the assessments I've chosen have been appropriate. Maybe I'll get somebody else to conduct the assessment on my participant from at the beginning and throughout the process and at the end. And then we have a fair idea that it's not just what I say, or it's not just what the client says, or the participant says, it's what other people say. So the idea here is that you don't need to do that as somebody accessing these records. You can just rely on us to say, we've gone through and rated the quality of these studies, and this is what we think. Now, another feature of Neurobyte, which I showed you before with the, if you go to our search, you can see the slightly different coloured, like the lilac, I guess that's a lilac. Those ones, we can go to those particular records, click on them, and then what we actually get is we get a rehab summary. So this is a project that we did over a number of years. But what this does is, so you're going through the database, it brings up some records. You're really interested in what you see, but you don't have a lot of time, and you just want to get to the juice of what it is that the study says. So this is one that was done by someone I trained with, actually, Jessica Med and Robin Tate back in 2000. This was up until 2016, the only randomised controlled trial of an anger management intervention that had ever been done with people with traumatic brain injury. It was quite extraordinary. And it was a really neat study that was done as somebody's master's thesis. But I can go to this, if I've never heard of this, and I can find out about, well, what does this actually say? What were the outcome measures? What was the structure of the session? And I can get a very quick read as a clinician on how would I apply what they've learned in my own practice, and should I read further into this? So this is a massive time saver. Okay. As I mentioned before, we've developed some new features. One of the features we've developed is our online rater training. So we have two method quality rating scales. We have the Pedro scale, which is for group studies, which was something that we were able to use thanks to the Pedro initiative, which is the database that physiotherapists use. And so that's been in existence since Neurobyte began, and we were initially just collecting randomised controlled trials and other group studies to do method quality ratings on. So my own involvement with Neurobyte started back in the early 2000s as a clinician working in a hospital. I was part of a network of voluntary raters that would get sent out a paper or two every month, and we get to rate the method quality of these randomised controlled trials. And so in order to learn that, I needed to go to an all-day training session. But these days what we've done is we've actually put this all online, and anyone in the world can access it remotely. So one of the things about this is that you get training in the different items on the Pedro scale, and then we have little fictional journal articles, which are from the Australian Journal of Fictional Studies, and we have practice papers, and we do mastery tests, and we get, you get a little score, and if you get enough correct, then you actually get accredited in rating scales according to the Pedro. I've mentioned quite a few times that there's a lot of research that's in neuro rehab, which is single case research. If you've been, if you were at the positive behaviour support workshop yesterday, you would have heard about some single case research that Kate's published, but also you would have seen a randomised controlled trial that also was involving Kate, but also Jenny Ponsford led. And this was a massive, massive undertaking. Like, I'm quite blown away by what's involved in doing a randomised controlled trial. And as a clinician, the idea of doing a group study, as a clinician researcher, the idea of doing a group study is really out of reach completely. But what isn't out of reach is doing some single case research yourself. And so what we found is that there's been this proliferation of single case research. Over the last 10 years, the technology that we have around analysing single case research data has really improved. The way that we understand how data analysis should work, the way that we understand how papers should be written, has really improved. So there's this big proliferation. And then so over the last 10, 15 years, Robin Tate and Michael Purtices and others have developed these rating scales for single case designs. So we have the Robin T scale, and there's a manual. And last year we actually went live with training, online rater training for the Robin as well. So you can do the training on our website. And again, what we've got is learning all about the different items of the Robin scale. We've got practice papers. This is one that I wrote myself, Reducing Self-Injurious Behaviours in Adults with Intellectual Disabilities, using various restraint procedures. That was by Felicity Slapp, Ron Punch and Claire Twitch from Fenwick University in Punchbowl in New South Wales. And then we have a mastery test, and if you get all your answers right, then you get accreditation in that. And that just went live. So before I go on, are there any questions so far? I've been talking at a rapid pace. Yep. Thank you. We do care. All right, so just an example of this is one from my own clinical practice. So this was a 20-year-old man that had an extremely severe TBI. He had 30 days plus of PTA. His presenting issues were anger. He had a lot of anger. He had a really interesting case of OCD, and this didn't come out until quite a while into our treatment. And he presented as very depressed and socially withdrawn. Just as an aside, this was in the context of COVID, which didn't help a great deal. One of the problems we had was that he was very motivated towards treatment, but he had a problem with remembering key messages from therapy. And then, particularly with his anger issues, there was a big problem with him applying strategies in the moment as well. So I guess with this case, it's quite a familiar sort of complex sort of presentation that we're sort of used to seeing. So I thought, right, well, just a little bit more about him. So in terms of his cognitive profile, he had some intact, he certainly had quite a lot of intact cognition. He was quite good for structured verbal information like short stories, but he had an impaired recognition performance which suggested problems with registration of new information. and he had impaired memory after delay, particularly of kind of unstructured information, word lists, shopping lists, that sort of thing. He had some good visual memory, but he was subject to deterioration after delay again. So what this meant was that we could have great conversations in session, and we could cover lots of ground and run through lots of strategies, but it didn't generalise outside of the room. So it was great while it lasted, but it wasn't really helping him in his life. And as we know, if therapy is not really helping people outside the therapy room, then it's not really very helpful. So I thought, what do I do with this guy? How do I help him? So I thought, right, well, let's search Neurobyte, see what we can come up with. So we go to Neurobyte. As I mentioned, there's a few different kind of records within Neurobyte. And if we go back to those 404 papers on memory, we know that there's practice guidelines, there's group studies, there's single case research. So I thought, right, well, let's start with some practice guidelines. And so focusing on practice guidelines, I came up with the INCOG recommendations for traumatic brain injury for memory. So that gave me various different memory strategies to use, like internal compensatory strategies or environmental supports. I was going to use memory aids with this case. So what sort of memory aids should I use? So out of the I forgot an important key step actually. So this there's no pointer, is there? Okay. So if we look at this, this is the search page, and that's what the search results come up with. Then this is the record over here, and then on our results for the record, if you click on the Google Scholar link, it will actually take you to the paper itself. So that's how I got to this information. And then I got some recommendations about this. Now, in terms of his OCD, I thought, right, well, let's do some searching on his OCD, which is an anxiety disorder. What we can see is if we look at treating anxiety in people with traumatic brain injury, we get about 150 records that come up. And one of the ones that we got was a systematic review of anxiety interventions. This one's a bit non-specific, and so I did a keyword search on obsessive compulsive, and then we found a range of other studies that showed some potential uses for Mr. X. So out of that, we were able to structure a bit of an intervention. So we've got components of therapy for his OCD. We've got depression and social withdrawal, some interventions for that. We've got some cognitive supports, and we've got some recommendations about external memory aids. So, in summary, we've been around for about 20 years. Neurobyte saves you time by providing a curated search of other databases, and importantly provides a rating of the methodological quality of randomised control trials and other group studies and single case studies. We provide access to lots of different types of publications. So there's systematic reviews, practice guidelines. we have created with our team these rehabilitation summaries so that you can get information more quickly. And then we provide online rated training in method quality as well, so that you can understand how you might critically appraise different studies. If you're running a trial yourself, you can learn how to structure it best to give it the highest quality. So with the time we've got, which is about 10 minutes, I thought perhaps open up for your questions, but also we could do a bit of a live demo of searches that you want to do. So I think we've got a question at the back there. Sam. Yep. Mm. Yeah, maybe we can switch to that. So I think I press the escape button. Okay. And then I use the other machine. Right, gotcha. All right, so what are you searching on? Sorry, we've got a mouse that doesn't work. Recalcitrant mouse. Oh. There we go. All right, start again. So what are we searching for? Okay, so the target area is attention. And you can see under cognition we've got lots of different categories. So this is why the live demonstration is so much better. You can see everything we've got. All right, so we've got attention and for the neurological group, excellent. Okay, stroke or CVA, excellent. And then you've got a mic, fantastic. And then what else?
So I'm just checking what the other parameters are. Service or delivery mode. So it would be adults as our population.
Mm-hmm. In truth, there's not a lot of difference if you select an age group or not, because there's a real lack of studies about kids.
That's okay. That would work with adults, so it doesn't bother me too much.
Yep.
Unlucky if you're a child. And then, look, I'm not too fussed about the years.
We'll just click search on that, see what we get. Yeah, okay. Fantastic, it worked. All right, so we've got 237 records. Now, you were specifically interested in rehab summaries.
Yes.
Yep.
I suppose, the clinical problem we have is that we can see, okay, it's best practice to do metacognitive strategy training. And then to get to what that actually means might be 6 articles deep, and you've got to go back to, because every article will say, we used a modified process from the blah, blah, blah procedure.
Yep, I'm just scrolling through here. So there's some rehab summaries that I've passed through. Not sure if they're exactly what you wanted, but we can also do, just go back. Mm-hmm. Sorry, I'm just scrolling fast because I thought there was another one. Okay, we might not have that, but what we can do If we can go back to our search. Yep. Yep. Okay, so metacognitive. There's attention. Okay, so that basically takes you to the Cicerone guidelines, which if we look at that, takes you there. So this is it's almost 4 o'clock. So thank you everyone for your attention. It works beautifully, trust me. It'll save you heaps of time, it's wonderful, and thank you for your attention.